It was a cold night, the kind of night when even the air felt heavy and sharp against the skin. Maria wrapped her thin coat tightly around her shoulders as she walked home from the small cafe where she worked the evening shift. The cafe closed late, and by the time she finished cleaning tables, washing cups, and making sure the register balanced correctly, it was already past midnight. Most of the streets were empty, and the usual sound of cars had quieted down. The city seemed to be sleeping, except for the occasional bark of a stray dog or the humming of a neon sign outside a closed shop. Maria lived in a small rented room in one of the older parts of the neighborhood. The walls there were cracked, and the paint was fading. But it was all she could afford with her low wages. She earned just enough to pay rent, buy food, and send a little money back to her younger brother, who was still in school. Life wasn't easy, but Maria never complained. She had grown used to struggling. What kept her going was the simple hope that if she kept working hard, someday things might change. As she turned into the narrow alley that led to her building, something unusual caught her attention. There was movement near the garbage bins, the kind of movement that usually made her quicken her steps. Sometimes drunk men or street beggars rested there, and Maria had learned to stay out of trouble. But this time, her steps slowed. She saw a man, well dressed in what looked like a dark suit, lying slumped against the bin. His head was tilted to one side, his face partly hidden by messy hair, and his arm rested limply on the ground. Maria's first thought was that he must be drunk and dangerous. She hesitated, her heart beating faster, and considered walking away. But something about him was different. Even from a distance, she could tell the man didn't look like the usual wanderers she passed. His shoes were polished leather, shining even under the dim street light. On his wrist was a watch that looked far too expensive for someone sleeping in the garbage. His tie was loose, and his shirt was wrinkled, but the quality of the fabric was obvious. Maria took a cautious step closer. She told herself she would just check if he was breathing, then leave quickly. But when she saw his face clearly, she was surprised. He wasn't old or ragged. He looked to be in his early 30s, his features sharp, though now pale and tired. His eyes were half closed, and his lips moved as if he was whispering to himself. "Sir?" Maria asked softly, almost whispering. "Are you all right?" The man stirred, opening his eyes slightly, but he didn't answer clearly. Instead, he mumbled something she couldn't understand. His voice was hoarse, as though he hadn't spoken in hours. Maria looked around. The alley was empty, and the night was cold. If she left him there, he could easily fall sick or worse. She bit her lip, struggling with her thoughts. She didn't know who he was or why he was lying there, but she couldn't just walk away. "Can you stand?" she asked, bending down a little. The man tried to push himself up, but his body swayed and he nearly fell again. Without thinking, Maria reached out to steady him. His weight was heavier than she expected, and for a moment she thought she might collapse under it. Still, she managed to keep him upright. "Come on," she whispered, her voice firm but kind. "You can't stay here. It's too cold." The man didn't argue. He leaned on her shoulder, his steps unsteady, as she guided him slowly toward her building. Maria's apartment wasn't far, but each step felt like a struggle. She wondered what her neighbors would think if they saw her bringing home a stranger in a suit at midnight. But she pushed the thought aside. Right now, he was just a human being who needed help. When they reached her door, she carefully balanced him with one arm while unlocking it. Inside, her room was small and modest, barely big enough for a bed, a small table, and an old couch that sagged in the middle. She guided him to the couch and helped him sit down. He sank into it, closing his eyes as if he had been waiting all night to rest. Maria looked at him, unsure of what to do next. She didn't even know his name. She thought about calling the police or an ambulance, but he didn't look hurt, only exhausted and dazed. Instead, she fetched a glass of water from the kitchen corner and placed it in his hand. "Here. Drink this," she said gently. His eyes opened just enough to meet hers. For a second, Maria felt a strange pull in that gaze, but she quickly looked away. He raised the glass shakily and drank a few sips before setting it down on the table. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice clearer now, though still weak. "You're welcome," Maria replied softly. She sat on the edge of her bed, watching him with cautious eyes. The room was quiet except for the sound of his uneven breathing. Maria studied his face. Beneath the tiredness, there was a certain elegance in his features, the kind she had only seen in magazines or on television. He didn't look like someone who belonged in her world of broken furniture and second-hand clothes. Yet, here he was, lying on her couch, needing her help. Maria sighed and pulled an old blanket from her bed. She covered him gently, tucking it around his shoulders. For a moment, she wondered about his story. Who was he? Why was he dressed like a wealthy man but found sleeping beside garbage bins? Did he get lost? Was he abandoned? The questions circled in her mind, but she knew the answers would have to wait. As she settled down on her bed, still watching him, she reminded herself of one thing her mother used to say: when you see someone in trouble, help if you can. You may never know what difference it makes. That night, Maria didn't sleep easily. She kept half her attention on the man on the couch, worried he might wake up sick or in need of something. But at the same time, she felt a strange sense of peace, knowing that she had done the right thing. She had taken a chance on kindness, even if it meant extra trouble for her. Outside, the city continued its quiet slumber. But inside the little apartment, two very different worlds had just crossed paths, one of poverty and struggle, and the other, though hidden for the moment, of power and wealth. And neither Maria nor the man on her couch knew how much this simple act of compassion would change their lives forever. The morning sun crept into Maria's small room, slipping through the thin curtains that barely covered the window. The light fell across the couch where the stranger was lying, making him stir slightly. Maria, who had finally drifted into a light sleep after a restless night, woke at the sound of movement. She sat up quickly, blinking at the bright rays that made her tiny space look even smaller than it was. For a moment, she almost forgot what had happened the night before. But then her eyes landed on him, the man in the expensive suit who had been lying near the garbage bins just hours earlier. He was still there, still dressed in wrinkled clothes that didn't match the humble surroundings of her apartment. Maria stood and quietly crossed the room. She didn't want to startle him. On the table beside him was the empty glass she had given him the night before. His face looked calmer now, though still tired, as if he had been carrying a weight too heavy to put into words. "Good morning," she said softly. The man opened his eyes, squinting against the sunlight. He blinked a few times before focusing on her. His voice was low and a little rough when he finally spoke. "Where am I?" "You're in my apartment," Maria replied, keeping her tone even. "I found you outside last night. You were lying on the ground near the garbage bins. You didn't look well, so I brought you here." His eyebrows furrowed as if he was trying to recall the events of the night. He pressed his fingers against his forehead and sighed. "I see. I must have caused you trouble." Maria shook her head. "Not trouble. But you should be more careful. It's not safe to fall asleep like that." The man gave a faint smile, though it was more of an embarrassed one. He sat up slowly, adjusting his suit jacket. As he moved, Maria noticed once again the watch on his wrist, polished and elegant, something that looked out of place in her little home. "I should thank you," he said finally. "You didn't have to help me. Most people would have walked past." Maria shrugged lightly. "Maybe. But I couldn't just leave you there." There was a brief silence between them. The man studied her face, as if trying to understand why she had chosen to help a stranger. Then, almost reluctantly, he said, "My name is Alexander Grant." The name didn't mean much to Maria at first. She repeated it quietly in her mind, thinking it sounded familiar. But she didn't pay much attention. Names of important people weren't something she kept up with. To her, he was just someone who had needed help. "I'm Maria," she replied simply. Alexander nodded politely. "Maria. I owe you more than I can say." Maria gave a small smile but didn't answer right away. She turned to the tiny stove in the corner of the room. "You should eat something. It will help you feel better." She warmed up some bread she had bought the night before and poured tea into 2 mismatched cups. It wasn't much, but it was what she could offer. She placed the plate on the table and pushed it gently toward him. Alexander looked at the food with hesitation. Clearly, he wasn't used to such a simple meal. But he picked up the bread and took a small bite, then sipped the tea. His eyes softened a little as if the warmth of the drink brought him back to himself. Maria watched him quietly, trying not to make him uncomfortable. She could tell he was a man used to luxury. The way he carried himself, even when tired, was different. His suit, though wrinkled, was finely made. His watch probably cost more than her entire year's rent. And yet, here he was, sitting in her old chair, eating bread and tea from chipped dishes. For the first time since she found him, she let herself ask, "How did you end up there last night?" Alexander paused, putting his cup down slowly. His gaze shifted toward the window, as though he didn't want to meet her eyes. "It's complicated," he said. "Let's just say I wasn't in the best state of mind. I argued with someone important to me, and I walked away without thinking. I had too much to drink, and I didn't want to go home. That's how I ended up on the street." Maria nodded. She didn't press him for more details. Everyone had their own problems, and she wasn't the kind of person to dig into someone's private life. "It happens," she said gently. "But next time, find a safer place than a garbage bin." Her words made him chuckle softly, the first real laugh he had let out since waking up. "You're right," he admitted. "I'll remember that." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that let both of them think. Alexander studied the room again, his eyes lingering on the cracked walls and the small shelf with neatly stacked books and folded clothes. He noticed how carefully Maria had arranged her few belongings, as if she had learned to find pride in keeping order even when there wasn't much to display. "You live here alone?" he asked after a while. Maria nodded. "Yes. It's not much, but it's enough for me." "And you work?" "At the cafe down the street. Evening shifts mostly. It pays the bills." Alexander didn't comment, but something in his expression softened. He wasn't used to this kind of life, yet he found himself respecting her calm acceptance of it. She spoke without complaint, without envy, as if she had long made peace with her circumstances. After finishing the tea, Alexander stood. "I should go," he said. "You've already done more for me than I deserve." Maria also stood, brushing off her hands. "That's up to you. But make sure you're all right first. You still look tired." He smiled faintly at her concern. "I'll manage." "But Maria, thank you. Truly." Maria walked him to the door. She expected him to leave quickly and never look back. That was the way of the world. People came and went, and kindness was often forgotten. She didn't help him expecting anything in return. For her, helping was just something natural. But as Alexander stepped outside, he turned to her once more. "I don't forget kindness," he said quietly, his eyes holding hers. "Someday, I'll return it." Maria gave a small smile, not really believing him. To her, he was just another stranger whose path had crossed hers for a night. People like him didn't usually keep promises made in moments of weakness. Still, after he left, she found herself thinking about him more than she expected. His words, his tone, the way he had looked almost lost despite his expensive clothes, all of it stayed in her mind. She shook her head and went about her chores, reminding herself that she had her own life to manage. She had rent to pay, work to attend, and dreams that seemed far away but kept her moving forward. Yet, she didn't know that Alexander Grant was not just a stranger in a suit. He was someone whose world was built on power, wealth, and influence, a world completely different from hers. And though he had walked away that morning, the memory of Maria's kindness was already beginning to change something deep inside him. What had begun as a simple act of compassion was slowly weaving a thread between two lives that were never meant to meet. For the next few days, Maria went back to her normal life. She worked her evening shifts at the cafe, came home late at night, and spent her mornings doing chores or reading the old books she had collected from second-hand shops. She didn't expect to see Alexander again. In her mind, that short encounter was over. He had gone back to his own world, and she had returned to hers. But life has its own way of bringing people together. One evening, just as Maria was finishing her shift, she noticed a familiar figure standing outside the cafe. Alexander was there, dressed neatly in another fine suit, but this time he looked more alert, more composed than the man she had pulled from the alley. Maria paused at the door, wondering if she should greet him or pretend not to notice. Before she could decide, Alexander stepped forward. "Maria," he said with a polite smile. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." She blinked in surprise. "You, remember my name?" "Of course," he replied. "I told you I don't forget kindness." Maria crossed her arms, half curious, half cautious. "What are you doing here?" "I came to thank you properly," he said. "That night, I wasn't myself. I didn't even know where I was. You helped me when you had no reason to. I can't just walk away and pretend it never happened." Maria sighed, adjusting the strap of her worn-out bag. "I didn't help you to get anything in return. You don't need to thank me." Alexander's eyes softened. "That may be true, but still. I want to. At least allow me to take you to dinner." Maria almost laughed, though not out of rudeness. The idea of someone like him, well-groomed, wealthy, powerful, taking her, a simple cafe worker, to dinner felt almost unreal. "Dinner," she repeated. "I don't think I belong in the kind of places you eat at." "Then you choose the place," Alexander said simply. "Wherever you're comfortable." His answer surprised her. She studied his face for a moment, trying to see if he was joking. But his expression was sincere, patient, as if he was willing to wait for her answer no matter how long it took. Finally, Maria shook her head. "I think it's better if we keep things simple. You go back to your life, and I'll stay in mine. That's how the world works." Alexander didn't argue, but the disappointment in his eyes was clear. Still, he gave her a small nod. "If that's what you want. But I'll be around, Maria. I don't give up easily." With that, he left her standing by the cafe door, her heart strangely unsettled. The next few days, Alexander kept his word. He didn't overwhelm her, but she saw him now and then. Once, he stopped by the cafe and ordered coffee just to sit quietly in the corner, watching her work. Another time, she found him waiting near her building, not intruding, just standing as if to make sure she got home safely. At first, Maria found it strange. She wasn't used to this kind of attention. Men in her world didn't usually linger with patience or respect. But Alexander was different. He didn't push her, didn't shower her with gifts, didn't try to impress her with his wealth. He simply showed up, quietly, consistently, as if he wanted her to see that he was more than a suit and a fortune. One evening, as she was wiping tables in the cafe, Alexander approached her again. "Maria," he said, his voice calm, "I'd like to ask you something." She looked at him, expecting another offer she would have to refuse. "What now?" "Why did you really help me that night?" he asked. "You didn't know me. I could have been anyone. Most people would have left me there." Maria paused, her hand still holding the cloth. She thought about it for a moment before answering. Because you looked human, she said finally. Not rich, not poor, not anything else. Just a person who needed help. That was enough. Alexander stared at her, almost speechless. No one had ever spoken to him like that before. In his world, people always saw him as a title, a position, a source of wealth. But Maria had looked past all of that, and her answer shook him more than he cared to admit. For Maria, the conversation ended there. She went back to her work, but Alexander carried her words with him long after he left the cafe. As the weeks went by, their worlds began to collide in small ways. Alexander started visiting the cafe more often, sometimes bringing his laptop to work quietly at a corner table. He never demanded her attention, but he always greeted her warmly. Slowly, the staff noticed, and whispers spread among them. "Who's that man who keeps coming in for you?" one of Maria's co-workers teased one night. "He doesn't look like he belongs here." Maria rolled her eyes. "He's just someone I helped once. That's all." But deep down, she knew it was more complicated. She couldn't deny that she was curious about him. He spoke differently, carried himself differently, and yet he seemed comfortable sitting in her small cafe. One day, as she left work, Alexander walked beside her. "Maria," he said, "can I ask you something personal?" She hesitated but nodded. "What do you want for your future?" The question caught her off guard. No one ever asked her things like that. She usually kept her dreams hidden, locked away where no one could see how far away they were. But something about the way he asked, genuine, not judgmental, made her answer honestly. "I want my brother to finish school," she said quietly. "I want him to have a better life than me. And maybe one day, I'd like to have my own cafe. A small place, nothing fancy, but mine." Alexander listened carefully, his expression thoughtful. "Those are good dreams," he said softly. Maria gave a small shrug. "Dreams don't always come true. But they give me something to keep going." He wanted to say more, to tell her that dreams could come true, especially with help. But he stopped himself. He knew Maria wasn't the kind of person who wanted pity or charity. "Instead," he said, "maybe sometimes the right people come into your life to help make those dreams real." Maria looked at him then, her eyes sharp. "If you mean yourself, Alexander, I don't need saving. I've survived this long on my own." Her words weren't harsh, but they were firm. Alexander nodded, respecting her strength. Still, deep inside, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wanted to be part of her journey, not to save her, but to walk beside her. That night, as Maria lay in bed, she thought about everything. She knew Alexander was from a world she couldn't imagine living in. He had power, money, influence, things she had never even touched. And yet, when she spoke to him, he seemed human. Not unreachable, not untouchable. Just a man searching for something real. Maria didn't know where this strange connection would lead. But one thing was certain, the line between her simple world and his grand one was beginning to blur. And neither of them was ready for how much it would change them both. The days turned into weeks, and Maria noticed that Alexander had become a part of her routine without her planning it. He came to the cafe often, sometimes sitting in silence, sometimes talking to her during her breaks. He wasn't like the customers who complained about the smallest mistakes or demanded attention. He was quiet, observant, and strangely patient. At first, Maria thought his visits would stop after a while, but they didn't. And each time she saw him, she realized he wasn't just showing up for coffee. He was showing up for her. One evening, after closing time, Alexander waited for her outside. The street was quiet, the lamps casting long shadows on the pavement. Maria pulled her coat tighter around her and glanced at him with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. "You're here again," she said. "Yes," he admitted with a soft smile. I wanted to talk to you. She sighed. You've already thanked me more than enough. What else is there to say? He took a step closer but kept his voice calm. Maria, I want to help you. I see how hard you work, how much effort you put into everything. You shouldn't have to struggle this way. I can give you a job at my company. Something better than this cafe. Better pay, better hours. You don't deserve to live with so little when you work so hard. Maria froze, her eyes narrowing slightly. There it is, she said quietly. I was waiting for this. Alexander looked confused. What do you mean? You feel guilty because I helped you that night, she said, her tone sharper than before. Now you think you can pay me back with a job, like I'm some charity case. But I don't need pity, Alexander. I don't need saving. Her words stung, but he didn't back down. It's not pity, he said firmly. It's respect. I admire your strength, but I don't see why you should carry all of this alone when I can make things easier for you. Maria shook her head. And if I take your job, then what? I become another person who owes you something? I'll be the poor girl you rescued, a story you tell at fancy dinners? No, Alexander. I can't do that. I won't. Her refusal hit him harder than he expected. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of the wind moving through the trees. Finally, Alexander spoke, his voice quieter this time. Maria, you think I see you as someone weak, but you're wrong. I see you as someone stronger than most people I've ever met. I didn't come back into your life out of guilt. I came back because you reminded me what it means to care about something real. You're the first person in years who treated me like a human being, not a title or a bank account. Maria's chest tightened at his words, but she turned away. That doesn't change the fact that we're from different worlds. You live in one I can't even imagine, and I live in one you'd never survive. It's better if you stop coming here, Alexander. Before either of us gets hurt. She started walking away, but Alexander didn't follow. He stood there, watching her disappear into the shadows of her street, feeling the weight of her rejection. For the first time in years, he realized there were things in life he couldn't buy, couldn't control. That night, Maria lay awake, staring at the ceiling of her small room. She thought about his offer, his words, and the sincerity in his eyes. Part of her wanted to believe him, but another part reminded her of the truth men like him lived in a different universe. She couldn't risk being dragged into something she didn't belong to. Yet, the more she tried to push him from her mind, the more his face returned. His laughter when she teased him, his quiet patience when she refused him, the way he looked at her as if she mattered. She buried her face in her pillow, frustrated with herself for caring. A few days passed, and Maria didn't see Alexander. She thought maybe he had listened to her and left her life for good. Strangely, the thought made her chest ache. But one evening, as she walked past the small community center where she sometimes volunteered to serve meals, she stopped in her tracks. Through the window, she saw him. Alexander was inside, wearing a plain shirt and rolled-up sleeves, helping set up tables. He carried boxes of food, greeted people with a smile, and even bent down to talk to the children running around. He didn't look out of place, even though everyone there came from humble lives far from his own. Maria's heart skipped a beat. She pushed open the door and stepped inside. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice half annoyed, half surprised. Alexander turned and grinned at her. "You told me not to throw money at problems. So I thought I'd start with my time." Maria folded her arms. "You think this will change my mind?" "No," he said honestly. "I'm not here to change your mind. I'm here because you showed me something that night. You showed me that helping isn't about money. It's about being present. I want to learn that." For the first time, Maria didn't know what to say. She watched him continue working, joking with the volunteers, serving food with genuine kindness. He wasn't pretending. He wasn't trying to impress her. He was simply there, doing his part. Over the next weeks, Alexander kept showing up at the community center. Sometimes he helped in the kitchen, other times he served meals or fixed broken chairs. He never boasted, never asked for recognition. Maria couldn't ignore it anymore. He was changing, piece by piece, becoming someone different from the man she had met in the alley. One evening, after everyone had gone, Maria found herself sitting beside him on the steps outside the center. The air was cool, the stars faint above them. "You're stubborn," she said with a small smile. Alexander laughed softly. "So are you." They sat in silence for a while before Maria finally admitted, "I don't know why you keep coming back. You could be anywhere else, living your life of comfort. Why waste your time here?" He looked at her then, his eyes steady. "Because for the first time in years, I feel like I'm doing something that matters. And because I don't see this as a waste. I see it as the beginning of something I never knew I needed." Maria's heart raced, but she quickly looked away. She wasn't ready to let her guard down, not yet. Still, she couldn't deny the truth anymore. Alexander wasn't just another rich man passing through her world. He was someone willing to leave pieces of his world behind to step into hers. That night, as she walked home, Maria realized something had shifted inside her. She didn't fully trust where this path might lead, but she couldn't deny the change in him or the quiet change happening in her own heart. What began as an act of kindness in the cold night had turned into something neither of them had expected. And though Maria still resisted the idea of letting him too close, she knew the walls around her were starting to crack. The weeks turned into months, and Maria could no longer deny what had become a new rhythm in her life. Alexander was still there, sometimes waiting outside the cafe when her shift ended, sometimes joining her at the community center, sometimes walking her home with quiet conversations that stretched late into the night. He never forced his way in, never demanded more than she was willing to give, and that patience made her lower her guard little by little. Maria noticed the changes in him too. The man she first met lying helpless near a garbage bin was no longer the same. His expensive suits remained, but there was less pride in the way he wore them, less of the untouchable air that once surrounded him. He still had money, still had a company to run, but when he spoke of those things, there was a softness in his voice, as though he had begun to realize that wealth was only one part of life, not the whole of it. One evening, after the community center had finished serving dinner, Maria found herself sitting beside him at a wooden table, both of them sipping tea. The noise of laughter from children playing outside drifted through the open windows. "You don't seem like the kind of man I imagined you'd be," Maria admitted. Alexander raised an eyebrow with a smile. "And what kind of man did you imagine?" She chuckled lightly. "Cold. Proud. Someone who thinks the world belongs to him. That's what I thought rich men were like." "And now?" he asked softly. Maria hesitated, then said, "Now I see someone who's trying. Someone who's willing to step outside his comfort zone. But I still don't understand why." Alexander's eyes rested on her, gentle but firm. "Because you taught me something no one else has. You showed me that worth isn't measured in money. That night, when I was at my lowest, you didn't ask who I was or what I had. You saw me as a person. That has stayed with me. I don't want to lose that lesson. And," he paused, taking a breath, "I don't want to lose you." Maria's heart tightened at his words, but she quickly looked down at her cup. She wasn't ready to answer, not yet. She had lived too long guarding her heart against disappointment. As time went on, however, she couldn't deny the truth. The walls she had built around herself were slowly breaking, and Alexander was becoming part of her life in a way she hadn't expected. One rainy evening, Maria returned home to find Alexander waiting by the entrance of her building, holding an umbrella big enough to shield them both. His hair was damp from the drizzle, but he didn't seem to care. You'll catch a cold if you keep waiting outside, she scolded gently. He smiled, handing her the umbrella handle so they both held it together. Then let's walk. I like walking with you. As they walked through the narrow streets, puddles reflecting the faint glow of street lights, Alexander spoke quietly. Maria, there's something I want to ask you again. Not as someone trying to rescue you, but as someone who wants to share something real. She glanced at him, waiting. Would you let me be part of your world? He asked. Not to change it, not to take you away from it, but to walk in it with you. Maria's steps slowed. His words were simple, yet they carried a weight that pressed on her heart. She thought of all the nights she had lain awake, telling herself their worlds were too far apart. She thought of her brother, her work, her dreams of owning a small cafe. And then she thought of Alexander, showing up again and again, not with promises of riches, but with his presence, his time, his willingness to learn. Why me? She whispered. Alexander looked at her with complete honesty. Because you're the first person who made me feel human again. Her breath caught, and for a moment, she couldn't speak. Finally, she said softly, if I let you in, Alexander, I need to know you're not here just for a season. I've lived with too many temporary things in life. I need someone who stays. He didn't hesitate. Then I'll stay. That night was the beginning of something new. Maria didn't let herself fall quickly. Her cautious heart still tested him, but Alexander proved, time and again, that he meant his words. He came to the cafe and washed dishes beside her when the staff was short-handed. He helped her brother with schoolwork, patient and kind, never acting as though his time was too valuable. He laughed with her, listened to her, and even argued with her, but always with respect. Slowly, Maria allowed herself to believe. One afternoon, months later, Alexander invited her to a quiet park outside the city. The air was fresh, the grass damp with morning dew. He led her to a bench beneath a tall tree, carrying a small box in his hand. Maria frowned at him suspiciously. What's that? She asked. Alexander smiled nervously, a rare sight. Something simple. Nothing grand. He opened the box, revealing not a diamond ring that sparkled with wealth, but a small silver band, plain, unpolished, humble. Maria's eyes widened. Alexander, I don't want to overwhelm you with riches, he said softly. I don't want you to think this is about money. I chose this because it's simple, like you. Like us. All I want is your answer. Will you walk through life with me not as the poor girl who helped a millionaire, but as Maria, the woman who changed my heart? Tears filled her eyes, unbidden, and she pressed her hand to her mouth. She had told herself 1,000 times that their worlds could never truly meet. But standing here, hearing his words, she realized that maybe love wasn't about matching worlds. Maybe it was about building a bridge between them. She nodded, her voice trembling. Yes, Alexander. I'll walk with you. Relief and joy lit his face as he slipped the simple band onto her finger. They sat there beneath the tree, no grand audience, no flashing cameras, just two people who had found each other in the most unlikely way. From that day forward, their story became one whispered quietly among friends, neighbors, and even strangers. People spoke of the poor girl who found a drunk man in the garbage and took him home, never knowing he was a wealthy CEO. They spoke of how he didn't repay her with money, but with a changed heart, and how together they built something far more valuable than wealth: trust, love, and a shared life. Maria never stopped working, and she never stopped dreaming. With Alexander's encouragement, not his money, but his belief, she eventually opened her own small cafe. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hers. And Alexander, often seen sitting at a corner table with his laptop and coffee, always said it was the best place in the city because it carried her spirit in every detail. As for Maria, she learned that sometimes life writes stories stranger than fiction. She had found love not in a fairy tale, not in riches, but in kindness, the kind that had made her stop in an alley on a cold night and offer a stranger shelter. And Alexander learned that the greatest fortune he could ever have was not in his company or his bank account, but in the heart of the woman who saw him as nothing more and nothing less than a human being.